On this episode of Ask an Artist, we have the godfather of visual effects, Allan McKay. If you're even slightly interested in high-level visual effects, you've probably heard his name pop up once or twice. Allan's worked on films like Star Trek Into Darkness, Flight, Transformers, and many more that you'll hear about throughout this episode. For everything we've discussed in this episode, you can find more info in the show notes below or at actionvfx.com/podcast. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Hey everybody, Luke Thompson from ActionVFX with another very exciting episode of Ask an Artist. Today we have someone you have already heard of, let's be honest. Allan McKay is with us today. We are super excited for this episode, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. What's up, Allan?
Hey brother, good to be here.
Great to have you. So Allan, the questions based around this Ask an Artist podcast, each episode is very question-centric. Last episode I had our founder and CEO, Rodolphe Pierre-Louis. His question was, why ActionVFX? And there were so many different questions that came to mind when, you'd agreed to be on this episode. But I think the one thing we kept boiling it back down to is, why visual effects? It's like having such, and knowing your history as far as from a super young age, being kind of drawn to the technical directing before that's what it was, it manifested into. There were so many different routes that you could have taken, so creatively speaking. So why visual effects? Why was that the one that kind of jumped out as far as being a medium that maybe you felt comfortable with, parameters you could control, whatever? So I know there's a couple questions packed up in there, but feel free to start wherever.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess with visual effects, I came from an artist background, and in a lot of ways, it's kind of, I think, a smart move to look at where things are going. So, it's easy to be like, well, this is what I know, but it's more about where is it all headed? And I think that that's a lesson that applied in the 90s. It applies now, whatever year we're up to. And it's always looking at aligning with your goal. So if you're looking at the work that you're currently doing, well, what's your end goal? Because that's to go off track for a second on question one, but that's typically what a lot of us do, is that we say, well, what software should I be learning? And it's always well, what do you want to do? Because you can listen to everyone else and be like, this software is dead, or this software is the best in the world according to these people. But none of that really matters. It's about, well, what do I plan to do with this? And for me, I loved video games back when I'm 11, 12, so that was one area, and I love movies, and that was another area. And both of those I didn't really know how to do, and I think that's the second part to it, is just I love problem solving, and I think the curiosity factor is always a driver for a lot of us. How did they do that? And that makes you want to go and figure that out too. The other thing I think is just really valuable with this is that with my career especially, I've sidestepped into so many different roles without ever having to start over. Typically, we'll have 3 careers in our lifetime. We'll work as a lawyer to prove our parents, make them happy or whatever, and then we'll go on and do something that we've always wanted to dabble with, and then later we'll find something that we're actually happy with, that's kind of a mix of all the things we want for fulfillment. But yeah, I think for me, without needing to start over ever, I've managed to direct commercials, produce shows, VFX soup on set, work as a technical director on the box, comp shots, animate characters for TV shows. I've managed to go and say, hey, I'm going to go and do this for a few months or whatever. This project would be fun. Why don't I go and model characters for a bit, just for the fun of it? That I think is really powerful. The fact that as an artist you can move into different roles and you're never starting over. You're leveraging the experience you have, the contacts you have, and you're able to repurpose that into new opportunities.
Yeah, I've always had such an immense respect for you, on a lot of levels.
Thanks, man.
But really being able to identify those paths as they were happening, and it really is, because when you say all the things that you have just said as far as animating characters and being a technical director and all of the above, I think the first thing that kind of comes to mind is that could appear as if it wasn't focused. But knowing you and knowing your story, it's the fact that you're able to do all of those so well, I think is what is really speaks to me as far as impressive diligence, drive for being able to hop in a specific lane, a specific discipline, and just give that your all and from the best of your ability. But the coolest thing is moving forward, and as you said, like building on that foundation that's already been put in place from all of those other things, because all of those, experiences culminate into the specializations that you start bringing to those other fields, or same field, but slowly expanding out. So yeah, just a lot of respect for you on that front. And even like transitioning over into kind of what you've been doing more recently, as far as like master classes and being able to do a lot of like training material. I guess, can you kind of speak to, was that a pretty natural transition for you to kind of start doing that? Because you're a really good and effective communicator, speaker. Like, I feel like that is kind of a natural aptitude. So is that something that just kind of was an overflow of already doing those things?
So I guess there's two questions there, but with training and everything, I mean, the first tutorial I ever made was actually one of the first sub-D tutorials for Max on how to model characters back in '97. And I think for me, it's just like, we didn't have YouTube back in the day. We didn't have anything. And especially back then, like, how do you create fire? Well, you can't. You get footage from ActionVFX, but ActionVFX wasn't around back then. It was Pyromania was the big one that everyone would get. And then Artbeats was slowly starting to come out, but their stuff was terrible. So, yeah, I mean, for the longest time, it was always like, you can't do that yet. And for me, it was always trying to figure out, well, how do I do that? And that was the curiosity that I mentioned before. But I also think that to get there, like I felt like, well, now I've figured it out. I want to share that with other people, so that way they don't need to go and spend 3 weeks obsessing about this thing and trying to figure it out themselves. And so I was always happy to share. And I think that we've always, in all of our industries, had pretty good communities for that. So back in the day, it would be on like IRC, like Internet Relay Chat, in chat rooms, just kind of being like, hey, check this out or whatever. And that, that to me has always just been a fun thing to share and give back. And I think that the more that we all do that, it just brings us all up. Because I might show someone how to do something, they'll come back 6 months later and be like, oh yeah, I took that concept and I built on it and now I got this. So it's just amazing to see that stuff evolve. That to me has always been a really fascinating thing to do, is just to try and share. And then 2004, I put out like my first training DVD. And again, it's just a way to kind of justify, like, if I'm going to take time off to really go all out, then it just kind of helps kind of cover the cost with doing that sort of thing. And then more recently, the more I've done this, the more I've realized like people are focusing on the wrong metrics. They're like, I want to get a successful career, I want to get my dream job, I want stability, I want to be paid what I'm worth. So let me go and learn Houdini because I heard that's the best thing and that will give me all these opportunities. And it's not the right approach. It's
right.
If you want to get job stability and all these other things, then get people to know who you are, get them to understand your value, not I know some software package, therefore everything should come easy, because it's not the way. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of been a natural thing of seeing kind of like a 30,000 foot view of people want this result, people going in the wrong direction. So that's where I've started to lean more into career, because it's not the sexiest topic to talk about, but it's literally the thing that will change your life, and it'll be the difference between being successful or not. The one last thing I was touch on is just in terms of effective communication. I think it's definitely, I think communication is the number one skill anybody on the planet should have, no matter what career you're in. And at the same time, like, that's definitely been something I've had to work on. Like, I think I always thought I was confident growing up, but I think in most situations I probably wasn't. But that was something where I actively started to put effort into getting better at. So I think in Vancouver in like 2008, I decided, just when I moved to Canada back then, I went out 7 days a week for a minimum of 2 hours. I was go out by myself, because going out by myself to a bar or a restaurant where I don't know anyone scared the crap out of me. And it got to the point where I enjoyed going out by myself more than going out with friends, because with friends, you're anchored at a table and you can't move around as much. But when you go into a place where, even if you don't know anyone, but you've been working on just being better at communicating, making friends, and nurturing relationships, that just became a natural muscle that I could walk into a room and just by 30 minutes later, I know everyone in the room. If I'm getting up to leave a table, people are yelling out, shot over here or whatever, and just having fun with it. So that's definitely something I felt like there are some people probably naturally good at that stuff. I know some people think I'm naturally good at that, but it's definitely taken work. But it's also
Yeah.
been something that now has become a life skill. Like, it's been
Yeah.
valuable for client relationships, you name it.
Hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, and that's one of those other like overnight success things, right? It's like
Hmm.
nobody sees
That's
the
right.
practice and the hours put into like working towards something, but it's
You
like,
log into
oh, here's a
Instagram, it's like,
result.
oh, I already got the blue tick and 2
Yeah.
million subs. Like, awesome. That was so easy. No.
Precisely. Yeah. I think one thing you touched on has a lot of parallels with the hey, I'm wanting to learn this software package because I want to be, I want to have a higher dollar value on my skills as an artist. I think a lot of people come, we've seen a big influx of that with like people getting degrees, or like they stay in college to push off their debt.
Yeah.
So they come out with a master's degree in some arbitrary thing that they're never going to use. But then they're like, here's my value.
That's
And
right.
it's just like, ooh.
Great. Where's your real? That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And so I think, at least me, I've learned to try to be a lot more patient when it comes to, this specific group of people has been set up with false expectations.
Yeah.
So it's like at the beginning of the race, it was already fixed for them to lose. And I think when I kind of go into it with that perspective, it helps me be a lot more understanding instead of like, why are you so entitled?
Mhm.
It's like,
I
because those are
have a
like,
piece of paper. It cost me $40,000 or $100,000.
yeah, yep. And obviously, like my own background too, I haven't, received any post-secondary education. I was homeschooled all the way through grade school, high school. I was able to be fortunate enough to start freelance videography when I was 15, taking
Great.
on a lot of like marketing, filming gigs, pretty much anything I could get my hands on at the time. And I feel like that is, decently similar to your background, but I feel like your background is like so much more hardcore because, and you talk about it quite a bit. Like I think that helps as far as like I'm big on origin stories, and you have an epic one, sir. Um, but building all the way, I think me starting younger, you starting younger as well, really helps us connect our expectations to reality when
Mhm.
it comes to is someone willing to pay for this service or not. It's
Yeah.
like there's no classroom hypotheticals. It's like they're either willing to do this or they're not. So I think that kind of helps ground it a bit more instead of setting up to, as you said, and that's a lot of your educational tools that you've released, I think are so practical. And you even mentioned like they're not the sexiest thing ever, but I think they're the most important because that's the real stuff. Like your VFX calculator, how much should you be charging based on this? Like every time I see something like that, or you promoting the work of like one of your students, I can see the fulfillment that you have of seeing other people succeed.
Hell yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
something that I think a lot of people, I wish more people had that, but that's also something that like I really can lean into a lot because I genuinely want people to succeed.
Mhm.
Like they can be better at me. I think it helps me also be a better leader when that's my mindset. Whether it's like a team of people or anything else.
Any good successful leader usually is going to surround themselves with people much better than them. And I think that's like the critical thing. I think a lot of us, it shocks me when I do meet people who are, you can tell they're insecure about like being the best in the room or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
I've even had to pull aside some supervisors who are so counterintuitive because they're secretly doing everyone else's job. They're trying to do it better than them
Yeah.
and show them up. And it's just like, no, stop being intimidated by the freelancers and other talent coming in and, that your job's on the line or something. Like,
Yeah.
their success is your success, and
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately not everyone sees that. Like I will just touch on the whole topic of like not everyone sharing. Like I still remember when I was like 18, I commented on, he's now a pretty, I'll say popular or famous, I don't know like what the difference is, but popular director here in the States, but I worked with him in Australia back when I was 18, and I remember just commenting on some Photoshop image he made. And it's just more of a compliment. I didn't really care, but I was like, cool work. How'd you do that? And I remember him being like, what's it to you? And kind of covering his screen. And it's just, to me, even in that moment, it's just so obvious. Like the more that you're clinging onto your couple of tricks, the
Mm-hmm.
more that you're essentially going to be replaced long term.
Yep.
The more that you're not if you just freely give out everything you have, it forces you to grow. And if you're just saying like, these are my like 5 things, this is, by adding 2 glows onto my sparks, like it just looks amazing.
No!
Everyone comments me on.
It's my secret recipe.
That's right. Like, if that's what you've got, then 10, 20 years later, it's still like, oh, that you're still doing that thing. So I think it's always about evolving and growing as a person and as a creative. And the more that you think that those little tricks define you, what happens when there's a button for that? What happens when Yuka comes out with a new node called Double Glow, and it's like, crap, now I'm out of a job. So I think it's always about evolution and forcing yourself to grow.
Yeah, and if you're able to kind of like dig in to those foundational principles that will stand the test of time, regardless of software, like I think that's a really important thing as well, because it's not just, hey, how did I make this in 3ds Max, and that's the thing that you're tying to, but being able to actually, like, even after a project, retroactively look back and say, what are the more foundational components that I'm bringing to this, of from a technical perspective, how did I approach this project, and like what are some of those still tangible, but more like they could be software agnostic, because it's more of like a mindset that you get into. I think that's very, very important when it comes to the replaceability factor, as you were saying. Also,
just looking at the projects you do, like once you've done a job, like what went right, what could I do better? And most people aren't willing to turn the microscope on themselves, and that's the problem. Because again, it kind of goes back to humility, about surrounding yourself with better people or being intimidated by other people. The same way, like if you can't look at yourself and see like, oh yeah, you know what, I could have done that better, and that's not self-deprecating. It's literally just saying like, you know what, now that I understand the process better, how about I 50% of what I'm doing is just sketching out my ideas before I even start, or whatever it might be. But that's going to save you going down this rabbit hole, wasting weeks of time trying to get to the look or whatever you're trying to do in a much more complicated medium like 3D.
Yeah.
So whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we've chatted off air once or twice about, this is a selfish question, but the whole story of how it came about for you to do the Avengers poster. Like, could you just back up? And I know you've shared it a million times, but like, I like it, and I selfishly want to hear it again.
I'll give like a really fast-paced version, which would be that I think it's interesting because I remember early in my career people saying like, you don't want to get pigeonholed and you don't want to do this and that, and that was always like a bad thing, that you're going to get typecast as only being the person who adds glow to your sparks. That's going to be the recurring theme for today. So whatever it might be that you might get pigeonholed for, and it wasn't until fast forward 20 years or something, I'm looking back at my career and I'm like, well, I've been pigeonholed in everything. It didn't mean that I only got those sparks. It didn't mean like,
because
you
didn't
like
let
one
it
thing.
right. You didn't let that define.
Exactly. I mean, if anything, you are letting it define you, but you're letting everything define you. So in other words, you want to be the go-to person. That's the whole point of building a personal brand, is that you want to be the go-to person that everyone comes to for this thing. And it doesn't mean, in the world, because everyone's going to be like, well, I can never do that, or there can only be one. And that's the scarcity mindset that we all fall into. But it could be just like with your client, whenever they need really good animation, they go to you. Or, not blowing smoke up your butt, but if you need great stock, then it's like, go to ActionVFX. I mean, I talk about you guys all the time, because to me it's like, okay, finally people doing it right. And that's why I've also been invested in you guys, like in terms of is there another word other than emotionally, but you know what I mean? So
Kickstarter. I mean, you backed our Kickstarter.
I guess it was financially.
Yeah, and like we mentioned that in the last episode, but it's like that really meant so much to us. Someone of your caliber just being able to step up. Even the best part is you really don't need our stock based on like the work that you do. So that meant a ton to us in that. So not just emotional.
Man. I mean,
financial.
For me, it was just more, I saw what you guys are doing. It's just like, hell yeah, like I want to help.
Thank you.
But that's just it. Like it's more about people being aware of you. And we are in an attention-based economy where people are all fighting for attention, and if you can kind of hold that place of when someone has a problem, they think of you as the solution, then you've won. Like, that's the whole point. And it doesn't need to be the world. It can be with those clients, you over your competitor in your small town, whatever it might be. So to me, it's always been like, I'm pretty proud of it. But like when it came to fire explosions, like my first day at ILM, people kept coming up to me saying, "Oh, you're the explosion guy," and I'm like, "How the hell does anyone at ILM know who the hell I am?" And that was cool. I got to speak. I taught some workshops there as well and everything.
Yeah.
And it was just, for that's one thing. And then for water or for max particle flow, type flow, Houdini, whatever the hell, like, it's just the more that you can kind of hold that position, the more that people go to you for that. Like Rhythm Hughes, they're like, we've always custom made our solutions, like for water, for whatever we're going to do, we build it from the ground up, and we now need to build a fire pipeline, and we're thinking, well, why don't we just get Allan to come in and build our fire pipeline? Like, that's the sort of stuff that's happened in the past that I've just thought is so cool. So going back to it all, like, that was just it. Like, to me, I started seeing pigeonholed is only bad if, like, let's say you are that person clinging onto your 5 secrets and they go to you for that one thing because you never evolved. But if you're building a reputation with people for doing plane crashes, for doing explosions, fire, characters turn to ash, all the different things that come up, game effects, whatever it might be, suddenly you've got many pigeonholes. All it means is that you've built a brand where people go to you for that thing. And so for Fume Effects, for all these different programs, I definitely made sure that I would be the person that people would turn to when it came to, hey, we need somebody. Working on Blade back in 2004, which is kind of where you were alluding to, like, that was a really fun project where I'd already done some similar stuff, like, because I like Buffy and all those shows back in the day that, particle disintegrations was always fun, character effects. But working on Blade, I still remember the day that the owner, like, came over and not in a sexy way, but whispered in my ear, like, hey, would you be interested in creating the pipeline for Blade for all the character ashing stuff? And I was just very casual, like, yeah, I think I can do that. And inside I'm just like, oh my God. So, yeah, and I came on late into the project because I had to get my visa updated to work in the US. And so I came in like after most of the pipeline had been developed, but we worked on, I forget now, it's like, I think it was 120 vampires or something. So I did all that. And then after that, there's another show with ashing, and then Daybreakers, which was the Spirig brothers directed that. They're from my home city as well. So they came back to town and they're like, hey, we're looking for a bunch of studios to do all this vampire work, and we want it to look like Blade. And coincidentally, there's another guy that was in my city that worked on Blade 2. I worked on Blade 3. So we just teamed up instead of competing, and we're like, let's just have carte blanche on the project. We took the shots we wanted to do, and then bit by bit, like God of War, I was working on set and I got a call, emailed some storyboards for that. I'm like, oh my God, this is awesome. And so each project kind of like led to the next, where someone would say, I love Blade, I love Daybreakers, I love God of War. So that's what happened with Avengers, was that I got a call and they're like, we want you to do what you did for God of War. But I think they had scheduled like a week for it or something, but they wouldn't tell me what they wanted me to break or turn to ash or whatever. And so just because they wouldn't get specific, I ended up turning down the job. Like they're like, it's for a Marvel project. I'm like, I don't care, like, because I'm not gonna walk in setting myself up for failure.
Right.
Like, God of War was like 8 weeks of killing myself, and then they're like, we want it in a week. We won't tell you what it is.
Nope.
And I was trying to educate them, saying like that was like some of the sims were about a week to do, and so I ended up turning down the job, and then the creative director, like under the desk, was texting me like, it's Avengers. And that's where I'm like, I still kind of don't care. But then he got a bit more specific about what they wanted. I'm like, all right, let's do it. And yes, I flew down, and then I didn't realize Marvel was going to be looking at it that same day. And usually with effects, like, you need a couple of days before you can show anything. Yeah. But somehow that project worked really smoothly. I've actually got the poster on my wall over here. But I was talking with Boss Logic, who's a pretty big digital artist, and he designed some of the posters for Avengers as well. And that was just really fun to actually, instead of saying I worked on that movie, to actually say I did that. And it had been so long since I've actually been able to point at something that isn't in the film and say that. But that was like a really valuable lesson. It's just like the success from one thing gets you more well known for that. So rather than thinking I've got to do everything, where no one's going to then associate you, like name the best artist you know who does everything. You can't. But if you said, what's the best artist for character modeling? You might say Raf Grassetti or someone like that. And for everything, you're going to have a best of for a certain thing. That's where your brain is going to go. But you can't do that for everything. And unfortunately, that's again scarcity, where people are afraid that if they do get known for one thing, then they'll miss out on every other opportunity because they didn't qualify. And that's not the case at all. You'll always be considered for those other things. They'll say, oh, this, Raf does amazing character models, and I wonder, if he could come on board to do some tanks and planes and stuff like that, if that's his thing. They're not going to say, oh, well, unfortunately, he only does goblins. So, it's one of those things that unfortunately we wrestle with. It's natural. But that to me has been the thing, is like for Ash or stuff like that, I'll always get the calls. And I've definitely turned down some jobs. Like I walked out of a meeting with Luma. They're doing Fright Night, the reboot. And I was sitting down with the owners of the studio, and they're like, what have you been up to? And I'm like, it seems like all I do is damn vampire ashing effects. And there's this nervous laugh, and I realized like, oh, they're doing that. So I said, I'm sorry, I gotta go. And I think they were a bit shocked by that. But it was just like I didn't want to do anymore. But that's just it. You get piggyback from your last project and your last project. They all align. They amplify you and qualify you, if anything, for those things. So that way it's a no-brainer that they're going to give you the job.
Yeah, that's great. And there's so much like good insight in that, I feel. So first up, I mean, congrats on the Allan McKay podcast. Like, you just crossed 300 episodes, which is insane. Like the amount of discipline and work to be able to, be consistent over that amount of episodes, that amount of time, like I think is extremely admirable. So huge congrats, because that is not a small feat. Throughout that 300 episode stretch, I mean, I'm sure you've learned a ton, over that period of time. Is there any like specific guest, maybe a specific principle or something that just kind of jumps out as, and it could even be just like a culmination of, experiences as well. But I guess in more simple terms, like, what have you learned, or what are some things that you've learned just kind of over discussing with that many artists over that amount of time?
I'll say that originally I had this idea because I'd be sitting at ILM and other studios like that, where just at lunch you're casually chatting. It's just like, or being on stage doing like a panel, and you're just nerding out talking about motion blur samples with like Neil Blevins and a few other guys, like, and this is just normal chat that you guys would do. But then you realize like the audience is just like, oh my god, this is amazing. And I always thought it'd be cool just to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations. And so I originally had a series I was putting together called the Artist Insight series, where I decided to go and film all these, and I never edited a single one of these until I had about 30 episodes in. I'm like, okay, time to start trying to put this stuff online. And that's when I realized that nothing was syncing up, that like I think pausing the audio, it was just terrible. I had people helping out trying to edit it all. So that was like a valuable lesson, is just like get something up and then just see how it works and get better, progress over perfection. But I felt like the model worked really well. And one of my buddies, Delcio Gomez, he's over at ILM, he mentioned doing a podcast, and that's when it clicked for me. I'm like, yeah, there's no video, or at least originally, in podcasts. Like, there's no way I'm going to get it out of sync. This would be great. But 300 in, because we've got probably like 330 or 350 episodes recorded, and it's just some that are time sensitive get boosted up, and some there's been one or two that we've kind of pushed back like a year, and it's still relevant. So
it's a lot.
And I think like along the way it's been really interesting. I definitely felt like interviewing 3D people kind of confirmed a lot about how I felt about career stuff, that a lot of 3D people, the same thing, they're not ever thinking about like, how do I get my name out there, or get exposure. Like, illustrators and designers are very aware that they're running a business, but I still think even with 3D, like in the beginning, it was kind of difficult to get people on, just because they were nervous. Like, I remember one or two people, I think, have said like, I thought this was a scam, but then I started listening to podcasts, and now I can't stop listening, because they were like, why are you trying to get me on this podcast? Like, what's the catch? So I think early on it was kind of interesting doing that, but now we tend to go for more directors, producers, more thought leaders in the space. So it's a bit different, because I think all of those are a bit more self-aware of like, why they need to do those sorts of things. But we've had everything from billionaires to plenty of feature film directors. I had the head of Industrial Light and Magic. We had software companies. Beeple was on, which was really fun, just chatting with him as like his whole life was changing as he's gotten like now probably a couple $100 million from all the NFTs that he's been selling.
Insane.
Yeah, so it's been really cool overall. I still think episode 1 is probably the best episode just because it was just like, if you want to create a successful freelance career, this is like everything I know about it. And so I still look at that as being my favorite. But yeah, I mean, along the way, like there's been so many amazing people come on. You guys were on, which was really fun. That was the first selfie I've ever done over a webcam.
Yeah. I love looking back too, because that was such an early period for like our company as well. And that's very much a milestone that I'm like, what was I doing? You know, just like, which represents growth, hopefully. You know, it's just like, man, probably would have like been able to plan better and have, you know, better topics of discussion. But I appreciate you allowing us to
it was
hop
fun.
on. It was way fun.
Really fun. And one thing I'll selfishly say is that like doing the podcast has been great to nurture relationships. Like even just recently, there's been people I'm watching on TV. I'm like, I love their show, so I just reach out and be like, hey, I want to go on the podcast. And then from there, you know, we start taking the conversation offline, and you know that's been really valuable too. So I don't know if there's any specific lessons that I can think of, just because there's so many. It's analysis paralysis. I think one of my favorite would actually be Lewis Castle, the head of Amazon Studios. At least the game division. So he originally founded Westwood Studios and made Command & Conquer, Red Alert, Dune 2, all those games. And I think originally I just wanted to get him on the podcast so I could just talk about Command & Conquer, because that is such a big influence on my career, the game cinematics and everything else. But chatting with him, that was really inspiring. Just having someone who's now scaled multiple billion-dollar companies. Richard Branson bought his company. Yeah, I mean, he shared just lots of really great advice coming from being a artist back in the 80s video games, where you'd buy like the grid paper and you'd actually draw the pixels, you know, for all the artwork that you're doing and scan it into the game. That was kind of crazy, just to kind of get some insights into the history, but then a lot of the business advice that he shared along the way about making decisions. And like, I think the one reoccurring theme that everyone who I think is successful we've ever had on the podcast is always about the interpretation of failure, because I do think a lot of us struggle with the fear of failure. In fact, like, I know, not to ruin it, but I know you got Ryan, I'll say Ryan C, not to give it away, but like we talked excessively about that exact subject. Say hi, by the way. But both the fear of failure as well as the fear of success, because they're both real things that people are afraid of, like their big dream that they've always wanted to aspire to get. Well, what if they get it, and what if they don't live up to it, or you know, what if they lose it? You know, there's all these different things. So I think there's so many mindset things that we all fall into, and it's about trying to understand, you know, as I said before, progress over perfection. We're not trying to be the perfect version of ourselves. We're trying to work towards that. And part of that, like, you don't wake up one day, you know, or I want to say you're not born or start anything being an expert. Like, the whole point is to start something and fail 100 times, but keep going. And eventually you wake up one day and you're like, okay, now for once in my life, I'm not shit scared of how I feel, you know, of doing this job. I actually feel like I'm capable. I'm able to walk into work and confidently sit down and start doing my work, instead of thinking like, who's going to yell at me today, or how am I going to get in trouble?
Yeah, there's a ton that I can unpack from that, but that whole imposter syndrome that can kind of creep in, obviously, you know, you talk a lot about that because it's very real. Like, it doesn't matter. I mean, specifically with artists and stuff, you know, it's like you're building up this huge thing, and that can really become like an idolized piece of work, like you said. You know, it's like, if I can just make it over this boundary, or just, you know, direct my first feature film or whatever. But that scary realization that, like, whenever that person that has built up so much emphasis on that thing gets it, they've already set themselves up to not, you know, for that to not fulfill them. And so I think that can be a really dangerous place, and potentially transition to a dark place if those expectations aren't met, that like if it's something that I've put on myself. So I've really been trying to, me personally, over the past couple years, like really, really ensure that I'm enjoying the process. Because there's always going to be short-term projects that pop up. There's always going to be like short sprints where you just have to grind it out and like, that that's what it is. But if that becomes a pattern of your life and it's only these short stints that are like, well, if I can just make it out of this jungle, it'll be fine. Then you're going to realize, okay, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years has gone by and I really haven't enjoyed the process along the way. So I think that is very, very healthy self-reflection and being able to kind of keep tabs on, what are my personal goals? What are the goals I want, professionally in my career? But also how can I find fulfillment in the journey and the process instead of just hating my life the whole way through.
If I can add one more thing, I think this is the boldest thing that any of us can do is we're all saying, I want to do this and I'm going to do this one day and all these other things. I think it's worth stopping and actually asking yourself, like being real with yourself and saying, what am I doing right now that's actually moving towards that goal? Because most of the time we might say, I want to work in Hollywood films and you're doing architectural visualization stuff and that's fine, but what are you actually doing to move towards your goal? Most of the time we're actually moving away from it. We're going on this other track. And we're like, oh yeah, I want to do that eventually. But the further we go away, the further we get more comfortable saying, well, that ship sailed, or there's more opportunities over here now. But if you can start looking at like, well, if I want to do this, what am I actually doing that's aligning with that? Then that's a chance to actually start to say, holy crap, like my someday goal is over here and I'm going in this direction. So now it's time to start making some changes, even if it is just doing it as a hobby or something to recourse correct and start moving towards it. But most of us aren't actually moving towards our goals, and that's the scariest thing of all.
And there's also the trap of busyness that plays into that
or the excuse of I'm too busy, because it just says that where's your priorities. If I'll quickly interrupt and to say that if it's kind of like one of your friends, and I'm guilty of this myself, but like I might reply 3 days later, and in reality it's not that, oh, sorry, I've been really busy. It's, sorry, I haven't made you a priority. And that's the truth, is that if this was a priority, if this was when you're single and there's this girl you really like message you would reply immediately. And that's just it. Like most of the time, we're not making the things that should be a priority. We're doing the things that make us feel good or are easy to do. And it's so easy to say, I crushed it today. I did 100 things. But the one thing that needed to get done, like pay your taxes or whatever it might be, you put that to the side. And you put it aside again the next day, until it becomes a pain point where you don't even want to think about it anymore, so you ignore it, and then it becomes a real problem. So it's easy to say, I crushed it, I got so much done, but that's busy work. It's not the stuff that actually matters.
I was having coffee, it's been a couple weeks ago now, with a gentleman in town that was talking about how he wanted to, this was the first time we had met, and so a lot of it was just kind of get to know you type of stuff, but he was wanting to pursue a career in motion graphics. And kind of took the formal education route, had been out of school for a little bit, and then I'm still like feeling out the conversation the whole way through, instead of just being like, hey, work hard, do this, so kind of just like slow stepping it. And so some of my questions were along the lines of, hey, like, do you have a reel? What kind of work have you started to do? And then it kind of kept leaning back, the conversation kept leaning back to relying on things that had been learned and not necessarily applied. But there's still this other conversation that's happening about like, hey, this is something I'm so passionate about, and like I believe that this individual wants to do those things. And so I kind of left being like, well, maybe I should have pushed a little harder. But at the very last second of our conversation, as we're saying bye, he asks me if I've got a new PlayStation 5. And then for like 45 seconds to a minute talks about how that's all he's been doing. And I was like, man, if you would have led with that, this conversation would have been totally different, because now I've got to leave. But it's that whole disconnect of where are your priorities at. And, I'm definitely not saying video games are the worst thing in the world. We help make video games and I enjoy them, and they can be very like fun. But if that is always taking precedence over those goals, it comes back to what's important to you, and
So
what are you going to do about
you're
it?
saying he was playing games all the time, not being productive. So
Yeah.
I think that's another thing to look at is that I was actually thinking about this oddly, I think earlier today, that if I were to mention to any of my family, like, or defend any of the kids in my family, like about playing games or something, that games are okay, they've made me millions of dollars. But
Yeah.
the thing is that there's a difference between being a consumer and being a creator. And whether it's social media or anything, because again, like, so many people are like, I'm not into that social media stuff, because in their mind they're thinking it's the crazy duck lips and selfies and everything
Hmm.
else. But for me, social media is a weapon. It's a business tool that allows me, as I
Exactly.
said before, to get attention on the things that I want to be associated with me. So if I
Hmm.
keep posting, work for my students, I'm proud of the work they're doing, and I'm also trying to get attention onto them, so people will say, hey, can I have their contact information, I want to hire them. And at the same time, it brings awareness through examples of what they're doing to, like, well, I want to be able to do that, like, where's Alan's course or whatever as well. So there's a lot of different things it's doing. For people it's entertaining, for some people, but for others they're going to see it as like, oh, I want that effect in my movie, can we hire the person who did that?
Hmm.
And ultimately the same thing of video games. Like, it's cool to play video games, but that's also the mistake most people make, is that they think into games, you're going to play games all day and eat pizza, and then they're shocked when it's like hard work and late nights and everything else. But that's just it. You can be a consumer of games or social media or
Hmm.
whatever else, or you can be a creator. You can be someone who's actually contributing to making those things and using it to leverage your career. But you can't say I'm consuming, in other words, playing games, and it's helping me in my career move forward. It's distracting you. It's prolonging you from doing that.
Yes, precisely. Well said. Well said. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about like your personal brand, and that's obviously something that is extremely strong as well. Outside looking in, as far as courses, master classes, all of that. So I don't mean to ask this question to gas you up, but when did you realize I am Allan friggin' McKay?
uh,
And connecting the dots between, I've established this brand, this personality, and
mhm.
it's something that I can continue to like lean into.
Yeah, I still don't think I've realized that.
I'm saying not
I,
to gas you up.
no, no, no. I think early on, like, it was pretty clear to me how important it is to get people aware of your services, and
Mhm.
I think also online as well. The more you want people to associate with the things you do, like, that's why the Allan McKay podcast is called the Allan McKay podcast, because originally I had the Artist Insight series, but if I'm being serious about my career, then I can't be managing two brands. So it makes sense to consolidate everything down, and that way when they think of the podcast, they're not going to be like, "Oh, wait, you're the host of that?" Like,
Yeah.
if it's called something else, like, they're two different things that are not going to resonate, opposed to everything just amplifying whatever it is you're putting out there. Um, so I think that's been important. Is just more looking at things from common sense, but yeah, I think along the way it was more about, you can look at, like, everything you're doing. If it's not going to a bucket, then, like, all the hard work, all the wins, your reputation, everything is just being thrown out there to the abyss, and it gets
Hmm.
lost. But if you're putting into a bucket, it's kind of like putting into your resume, but a resume that people get to actually interact with. Then the more that every win you have, every award, every fun thing you're doing, like, I'm never drinking again, like, um, just comical things that you can post online that people now associate with you. All of that, it becomes part of your brand. And we all have a brand. It's just whether or not you take control of it, or you think, well, I'll just let my work speak for itself, and you blend in with everyone else. So it's
Yeah.
more about just making sure that I did put everything into a bucket. I think that knowing that I came from Australia to work in the US, I needed to also be pretty proactive with this stuff, because
Hmm.
you can either have a degree. Like, Tim Miller told me this back in 2000, I think, that we're talking about work visas to go over the blur, and he said to me that, for every year that you don't have a degree, you need 4 years of experience. That was back then. Immigration policies have changed, but his philosophy was that for every year of your degree, well, for every 4 years of experience you don't have, like you should. Actually, I'm butchering. I forget exactly
You're
how he
good.
worded it, but he's basically saying the degrees are irrelevant, which is what you had mentioned, and at the same time, like, yeah, it's unfortunate that it is or it was designed that way. But it meant that for me, that because I didn't have the paperwork that the government recognized,
Hmm.
I needed to be very proactive with getting published in magazines and books and getting awards and all that kind of stuff. So that I think helped me be a bit more strategic about things, knowing that like I need this stuff because it doesn't matter what someone at a studio says about me. It's about proving to the government through
Yeah.
all these accolades that I know what I know. Um, but in the end, it's really like what happens. Like certain people will say like if you don't have a let's say like I don't need a brand because I got a full-time job. And it's like, well, what happens if they lay you off? What happens if the studio goes under? Which happens a lot. Like any, not just visual effects, like any company in the world, and that's the
Yeah.
problem. We see instability in visual effects, but it's not. It's the entire world. Like any business is
Right.
unstable.
Yeah.
90% of businesses fail, and that's just something to keep in mind. It's like, well, when you're walking out the door, laid off with your severance check, and you're going to start looking for work, making cold calls, introducing yourself to everyone else for the first time, and everyone else is doing the same thing at the same time, it's a bottleneck.
Yeah.
But if you're able to walk outside and pick up the phone and say, hey, what's up? I'm actually available next week if you guys have anything going on, and they know who you are, then it's a no-brainer. You just walk into the studio and sit down and go about your job, get a pay increase
Yeah.
while you're at it. So it's more about building relationships, but also building visibility around what you do, and that's the one thing that's important because I think it's kind of like features over benefits. You could say to people, I know Houdini and I have a degree, and I want $20 more an hour than the other artist because I'm faster. Like none of that means anything to the other person, and this is such a valuable lesson. It doesn't matter what it is
Hmm.
that we're talking about. You're talking about features, but if you want to talk about benefits, it's about sitting in their chair and thinking about, well, how does this benefit them? You being faster doesn't translate. But if you
Yeah.
said that the problem, like painting a picture for them, like the problem with most artists is that they tend to be quite slow. And I've found frustration with clients where they've actually left um, us to go to our competitor because they just felt like they didn't get to have any creative say in the process until the very end. And it's because it takes a lot longer for people to turn stuff out. I typically work a lot faster, and therefore I'm able to put it in front of them a lot sooner, so we can
Hmm.
have that creative say early on, which also saves us a lot of money because it means that they're able to give us the feedback that we need at the beginning, rather than having to change direction at the very end. And on top of that, they feel more confident in us, and it's always been how we get repeat business. That
Hmm.
would be a benefit where they instantly say, that to me is worth $20 more an hour,
Right.
opposed
Yeah.
to you saying I'm faster. And it's the same
Yeah.
thing. I have a degree, doesn't mean anything. But if you can work in a way to say that having the degree, meant that you were able to, learn the fundamentals of all these other areas that most people neglect, or the history of it all, whatever the hell, how to use a camera,
Yeah.
find some way to actually make it beneficial to them. Otherwise, it's just falling on deaf ears.
Yeah. And it's like it really is a sales pitch of
Everything sales,
yeah,
everything.
it really is. All communication is negotiation.
Going on a date is a sale. And I
Yep.
keep mentioning dating, but like relationships, whether it's business or romantic or friendship, like it's
Hmm.
all the same thing.
Yep.
And you are selling your services, you're selling your value to everyone.
Yep.
So
Completely agree. So, kind of wrapping up here, I know you have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of new things kind of in the pipeline as well. What's some of the stuff that, I mean, feel free to just hop in and talk about, whether that's like latest training
mhm.
classes, books, any resources. I know you are a wealth of knowledge and resources when it comes to like any type of effects artist. But
I
I guess
appreciate it.
if you could highlight one thing or kind of talk about like the latest
Mhm.
thing you're working on, what would that be?
Good question. So I was just working on a show, working on set for it. I can't talk about it yet, but I worked on the new God of War game, not the commercial that we did years ago, but coincidentally I mentioned Raf Grossetti, so he's actually the art director in God of War,
Nice.
and I ended up helping on that just for fun. I think it's called Ragnarok. I don't even know, but I think that's out this year. Again, I don't even know. And besides that, yeah, I just launched a course on building a personal brand strategy. So
Hmm.
it's kind of hard. Like basically for me, this is kind of the proudest thing I've ever done, which is I spent 7 months building this course, and we had like a beta team of people, and I just publicly opened it up. But this is kind of teaching people how to build a successful career by design. So being able to get clients to be aware of you, being able to even reposition yourself as a studio, so that way you can charge 7-figure bids, things like that.
Yep.
There's a lot, like, it's kind of been hard to sell it because it's kind of hard to say it's like this is the answer to everything. But yeah, like I said before, I think a lot of people, especially in 3D, tend to think more of like, I just want to know 3ds Max or this or that, instead of their career. But that was something that we just opened up registration for this year. That was kind of fun. Registration's closed for now, but if you go to my website, allanmckay.com, I'm sure it'll be linked somewhere, but you can get on the waiting list there. Besides that, I'm actually going to be launching a technical director course soon. So that was the other thing that, that's been kind of in the back of my mind for a while. And that's just because like I did a course about 7 years ago on how to be a technical director, and I only sold it once, and it was a huge success. Like, so many people just, how do I put this? Like, the whole point of it was to teach artists how to program and how to build pipelines, and essentially how to automate everything they do, both for themselves as well as for their studio. And the whole thing is that most of us think that, well, I'm not smart enough, or I don't know how to code, or whatever. And it's just been really fascinating to see people who've never coded in their life, who don't know math. I'm a high school dropout, and when I think about it, I pretty much stopped going to school when I was 9 years old. Like, I would go for about a third of the year, up until the point where I dropped out in grade 9. So, I think if I can program, then anyone can program, because I literally like stopped going after we learnt multiplications, pretty much. So it's not like I had any understanding of high school math or anything. So that's one of the new things coming up. And then I don't know, there's a lot going on, but there's a few businesses getting into with doing photogrammetry and LiDAR for working on set. Lots of different stuff. So there's certain other things that maybe I can, maybe I can't mention. You're smiling, so you know what's up. Yeah. So I mean, lots of exciting stuff. It's just more about either learning how to clone myself, which has been the ongoing joke for about 20 years, or working my priorities a little bit to make sure the right things get done.
Nice. Priorities. That's what it always comes back to, right?
Well, I'll just quickly jump in and say, like, I'm excited for you guys doing this. Like, one thing we didn't really get to, but I feel as though, like, anytime I've seen someone announce, like, hey, I'm doing a podcast, like, I've almost reached out to every single VFX podcast just to say, congrats, I wish you guys all the best, because I'm excited for more people to be doing this. And I've always found with those guys that you get about 3 episodes in, and then they just kind of stop, and it drives me nuts. And it's the same thing with so many people making big announcements for a lot of things, is that they make a big announcement and then crickets. And I know you guys aren't that way, so I'm excited for you guys, knowing that that's kind of been my secret sauce, has been accountability. Like, my assistant, she'll crack the whip and make sure, like, because there's definitely been times where I'm like, what if we're late? And it's just like, no, we're never late. So I think just having someone, whether it's you, Ryan, or whoever it might be, like, on board, just making sure that things move forward. You guys have such a great I'm not tearing up, I'm just really quirky today. No, you guys have such a great community of people, and everyone knows you guys, everyone loves you guys. I think this is great, and I'm definitely going to listen into it. I'm excited that you guys are doing this, so congratulations, and can't wait for your episode 300.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allan. Like, it definitely means a lot that you're helping us break in this first season, kind of get things off the ground. It means a lot. And as we kind of get into our 5-year anniversary, 6-year anniversary of ActionVFX, like, I've been getting super nostalgic looking back at the journey from Kickstarter all the way through to intense night shoots where I cry myself to sleep. And
I still want to go and hang out with you guys. Like, even if it's like, hey, we're just lighting tennis balls on fire today. Like, I'll fly down for that. Like,
hey, anytime, man. The invitation, it's official now because it's on the podcast. Anytime you're in East Tennessee, you have a place to stay.
What is it? Michael from The Office, like, he gets invited out. Actually, I think she's from Tennessee in the show, like Saber or something, that takes over the company, and she kind of puts out a very unofficial, like, if you're ever in town, and then he shows up in town.
Yeah, he shows up. I think it's like Tallahassee, Florida, or something. But yeah,
Yeah,
he
something like
shows up. That's such
That'll be me.
That's such a great episode. Anytime, man. And the flamethrower is all yours.
Sweet.
So we'll get some good photos for the Instagram.
Flamethrower in one hand and chainsaw in the other. Sounds great.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you
man.
so much, Alan. Again, definitely appreciate you being here. It's been awesome to see, even in the past 5 years or so that we've known each other, just your growth, being able to just continue to push the bounds of education, training materials. It's always super inspiring to me and us as a company. So keep doing what you're doing, and thanks for hopping on this episode of Ask an Artist. I appreciate it, man.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.